Hey, everybody. I am so excited because we're about to go where we have not gone before. Okay, yeah, you get the Star Trek reference because we got George Takei, Sulu, joining the podcast. Yes, I'm so excited to have Mr. Takei on board. He is a social justice activist, a social media superstar, Grammy nominated recording artist, New York Times bestselling author, and a pioneering actor. A lot of people don't realize this brother's been doing this for 60 years in both TV and films. But he stepped away from all of that to tell his very personal journey, a story about growing up in a U.S. internment camp during World War II, at the end of World War II, along with 120,000 other Japanese Americans. The book is They Call Us Enemy. The author is none other than George Takei, and we're about to get into it on the Michael Steele Podcast. George Takei, I tell you, dude, I am so excited to have you join the podcast, to be a part of this conversation. I spent my life. You spent so much time in my living room and in my office, here at my desk, watching you do your work, not just on the small screen and the big screen, but out in the community as well. You've become a genuinely effective advocate on behalf of groups, individuals, communities that are often underrepresented in the conversation, shall we say. And you have done such a masterful work. And I want to get into specifically the work that was born out of your new effort. They called us, I don't want to get it right. I want to get
That's
it right.
correct. They called us enemy.
They called us enemy. That's
the
correct. They
Excitement
called us
is
enemy.
on this end as well. I am so excited to be talking with one of my icons on MSNBC. The wisdom that you send out over the airwaves.
Well, I appreciate it, sir. So what inspired you? Because this is a very different approach to a very gnarly conversation about the placing Japanese Americans in concentration camps during World War II. You took a graphic novelist approach, which I found actually not just effective, but an important way to tell that story. Talk about your thinking there and what it was you were trying to do in sort of bringing the story of this little boy in these concentration camps to life through the eyes you now have.
Well, when I was a teenager, I loved comic books like all teenagers. And I initially wrote about my childhood incarceration in my autobiography, which was published in 1994.
Mm-hmm.
But that story is still not generally known, at least when I was thinking of writing another book.
Right.
And I went into great detail in my autobiography. It was published in 94. And I said to myself, I want to get the story to be a part of American history. We need the next generation to know about this chapter of American history. And remembering my childhood infatuation with comic books, I thought, graphic memoir, that's the way to tell the story,
Right.
to reach the next generation. And it turned out that was a good strategic move because it became a bestseller. So now I'm working on another version of that same story.
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing a children's picture book
Oh.
where I'll cover two generations, daddy or mommy reading the story to little Johnny and little Janie.
Mm-hmm.
So they're so I'm writing it with much simpler language. Words like swear allegiance or forswear allegiance,
Right.
I had to revise and say, love America. And forswear allegiance to the emperor, uh, stop loving someone. But
Hmm.
how do you stop loving someone who you didn't love in the first
First place,
place?
yeah.
So that's my current challenge, to put into simple children's words those ideas that we discussed as a graphic memoir, which was targeting more or less the teens
Right.
and early 20s.
You,
So
you,
that was the strategy.
it's fascinating the way you do it, because what I love about this approach, and it's actually an approach I've taken in my public work when I was lieutenant governor, and I'm dealing with sort of the difficult issues on education and what goes on in and outside of a family. So you can get the kind of resources a family may need directly to them. One approach that I took, which I really appreciate about this book, is you do it, I did it then, and you do it now through the eyes of the children. So this is not the perspective of an adult sort of telling the story, but it is the narrative as seen by a child, as experienced by a child. And even as you're describing the next effort, you still have that element of, yeah, mommy and daddy may be reading the story to the child, but you're still going to bring in that element of the child's experience
Mhm.
of what it is they're being told, or in the case of this effort, what they see and what they experience. How did that make you feel writing that? I mean, because that's a very unique perspective.
Well, I was 5 years old. I just turned 5 years old when the soldiers came, uh, 3 weeks after my fifth birthday.
Hmm.
And that morning is one that will remain in my memory. It's just burned into it. My father got, I was sharing a bedroom with my brother, Henry, a
Hmm.
year younger. And my father came into our bedroom and dressed us hurriedly and said, we're going to be moving. And daddy's got to help mama with the packing. So you boys go to the living room and stay there. And so we did as we were told, and
Right.
not having anything to do, we were standing by the front window, just gazing out at the neighborhood. And suddenly, we saw two soldiers marching up our driveway, carrying rifles with shiny bayonets on them. That was a shocking thing. They stomped up the front porch and, with their fists, began banging on the door. I remember how scary that was.
Hmm.
And my father came rushing out of the bedroom and answered the door. And literally at gunpoint, we were ordered out of our home. I was absolutely terrified, as was my brother. And my father took charge. He was cool and calm. He gave both of us small packages to carry, and he hefted two heavy suitcases, and we followed him out onto the driveway and stood there waiting for our mother to come out.
Right.
And she took a bit of time. We had a baby sister, not a year old yet, and when she finally came out, she had our baby sister in one arm and a huge duffel bag in the other, and tears were flowing down her cheeks. It was a morning I will never forget. We were piled onto trucks with other Japanese American families that had been gathered
Hmm.
together with their luggage. And we were driven downtown to Little Tokyo to the Buddhist temple, where there were other families all assembled. And there was a row of buses there. And we were all loaded onto those buses with our luggage and taken out to the Santa Anita racetrack, unloaded, and herded over to the stable area. And each family was assigned a horse stable, a horse stall to sleep in. I can't imagine now, today, how degraded and humiliated my parents must have felt. But to 5-year-old me and my brother 4 years old, we get to sleep where the horses sleep.
Right, right,
So,
right.
two different perspectives on the
Yeah,
same event.
yeah. It just, and as you're describing that, being placed in a horse stall, I'm thinking back to the previous administration putting kids in cages.
Exactly.
And the story that says about our government then, as a young 5-year-old George Takei, and what it says about our government now.
Very much
When
related.
that's still an approach they can take to dealing with human beings. When
Well,
you
the at the border, we always said in the horse stalls we had our parents with us. That was so important to us.
an important piece, yes, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
But at our southern borders, the children are torn away from their mothers.
yeah.
I mean, their stability, their source of security is taken from them and put in cages. So it's much worse now than it was for us. I mean,
Yeah, all
it's
things
a
being relative,
matter of
right?
degrees, but our parents were always with us, and that was the important thing
And
with
that's an
our
important,
sense of security.
because I can imagine it's a very different story for young George if, when you walk down that sidewalk to the awaiting vehicles, your mom and dad went into one vehicle and you went into another. Um,
Oh my Lord,
that's
never
a
occurred to us.
very different story. With that, and given your experience as a child, as a child in a Japanese internment camp, um,
Not a Japanese internment camp. Those were run by the government of Japan. I
Japan,
always correct
correct.
that.
That's
We're
correct.
Americans ordered out by the U.S.
That's
military
correct.
and taken to American barbed wire concentration camps.
That
I
I
always tell the press it's Japanese Americans.
right.
Japanese internment camps were run by Japan. We were not in camps run by Japan.
That's exact, and I stand corrected, and I misspoke on that. You're absolutely right about that, and I apologize for getting that wrong. The 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 point is, when, for you as a young child being placed in this type of an internment camp, what did that teach you about this concept of democracy in this great land, as a young child, and what did that say to you about being an American then? Because I want to relate it to later on in your life, when you are a young man starting out in Hollywood, and this opportunity to be on what will become an iconic program later on. There's a long march indeed for that, but it
Indeed.
starts there in the internment camp. And it really, in some cases, George, would negatively shape your view of this country. What was that process like for you as a young child, from that moment growing up into adulthood?
The vital factor in my life was my father.
Mm,
At that time, I wouldn't have understood democracy. My father, who was an immigrant, he was brought from Japan as a boy to San
right.
Francisco by my immigrant grandfather. Although he was born there, he was reared, educated, and went to college in San Francisco. He spoke Japanese and English fluently, and he loved America and our democracy. And so the word democracy was introduced to me in stages after we were
Mhm.
released. And when I entered my early teens, I had many, many long discussions after dinner with my father. And my father was an unusual man. So many Japanese American parents of my parents' generation never talked about it with their children.
Mm,
Many Japanese
really?
Americans, younger, know that their parents were in camp, but that's all they know. When we did the musical Allegiance, which we developed on the internment of Japanese Americans on Broadway,
Hmm.
younger Japanese Americans, and from my vantage point, if you're 60, they're younger than me, and I consider them young Japanese Americans.
Right.
They would come backstage to tell me how moved they were and how deeply impressed they were by the show. And they would tell me that their parents or their grandparents were in camp. That's the term that we use, in camp, in the Japanese American community. And so I'd say to them, "Oh, your parents or your grandparents were in camp. Which camp were they in?" Their faces are blank
Right. Right.
because their parents didn't talk about it.
Was that
Just
because of shame, or was that just because that was a chapter in their lives that their parents had just said, we just won't deal with that?
uh, it's both pain and shame,
Okay.
but the shame was misplaced. The shame was the government's,
Hmm.
and yet the victims take on that shame. And they remember the pain that goes with it. And so they didn't want to inflict that on their children. So they didn't talk about it at all. So they grew up knowing uh, my parents or their parents or their grandparents were in camp, but
Right.
that's all they know. Even if when I tried to help them out by saying, was it in Wyoming? Was it in Arkansas? Was it in Idaho?
Right. Right.
They know nothing about it, and so I felt an even more intensified mission to inform and educate other Japanese Americans about their own family histories. So I have a double mission to remind America of how fragile our democracy is and to let Japanese Americans who grew up knowing their parents or grandparents were in camp, but not any understanding of what that was
Right.
all about.
Right.
I have a double mission. My father taught me about the importance of citizen participation in government. And he urged his children, my brother and my sister, about participating in student government.
Hmm.
We have to be, he said, the ideals of American democracy are the words are shining words, but
Right.
they're just words. The people have the responsibility to make it have meaning. And so we have to be actively involved in the community, in in school, and I ran for student body president in middle school,
There you
and I
go.
won.
There you go, little politician.
From way back, from
Mr.
the time I was
President.
an early teen, yeah, I was campaigning, and my father had a grocery store at that time. He tried many things after incarceration, and through my father, he was able to get hard candy for wholesale. And so I had my pocket filled with hard candy. And when I went around the school corridors, I'd shake hands and I'd leave a little something sweet.
Oh, look at you. Oh,
And
and
in
people
high
talking
school,
about money and politics now, baby. It's all candy. It's all candy.
some sweetness, and that's what I was going to bring to them, and that was a sample of what I was going to give them. In high school, I was senior board president, and the first campaign that my father took me to was the Adlai Stevenson for President campaign
Wow.
headquarters.
Yeah.
And having campaigned for myself in junior high school, I saw what was happening on that grand scale.
Yeah.
Uh, Hundreds of people there, all volunteers, sitting at a long table, stuffing envelopes, and the next person would swipe it over a wet sponge and seal them, and so it was fascinating, and it was fun, and
Right.
it was exciting and inspiring. Uh, Eugene McCarthy, Senator McCarthy,
Mm-hmm.
would come in. I met Eleanor Roosevelt
Really?
for the first time in person. But an interesting thing on that day, my father suddenly felt unwell, and he had to go home. And at that time, I thought, oh, Daddy couldn't stay. He missed out on meeting Eleanor Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
But later on, I
Mm-hmm.
understood why. He knew she was a good woman,
Yeah.
but it was still his wife,
Yeah.
the man
Yeah.
who sent us into imprisonment.
Yeah. Still very
And
personal and raw in many respects for him.
it was indeed. So, but it was my father who guided us into participation and understanding of American democracy. And I became active in many campaigns for U.S. Senator for George Brown,
Mm-hmm.
Congressman George Brown for uh, U.S. Senate.
Senate. Yep.
He didn't win. Jerry Walde for governor of California. He didn't win. But then I joined Tom Bradley,
Oh yeah.
African American city councilman
Yeah.
and former policeman for mayor of Los
Mayor.
Angeles.
Yeah.
He lost the first time, but I got to know him well and became active in supporting all his activities. And so when he ran a second time, he asked me to be the chair of his Asian American committee.
Right.
And I was a young person, but he asked me, and I was more than happy to do that. And he won.
Yeah.
And when he won, he appointed me to the board of the Southern California Rapid Transit District with the mandate to get started on building the first heavy rail subway system in Los Angeles, because he
Oh,
said the downtown is going to be the unquestionable center of Los Angeles. Our reputation was that we're
it's so
sprawling.
spread out. Yeah.
He said this is going to be essential for downtown to be a vibrant, functional downtown. And so we got the half-cent sales tax passed for our match, and we went to Washington and lobbied for the federal match.
Right.
Went to Sacramento. So Tom Bradley was the one who involved me in all this actual
Got you up close and
work of the
personal with it.
campaign.
Yeah. No, but it's fascinating because from the story of your kitchen table conversations with dad about democracy, despite the personal family history and the tragedy around internment, that love of country and that sense of America's promise is still imminent and so important to the extent that you found ways to utilize that in grade school politics and getting involved publicly. So I guess in one sense I could say, or you could confirm, that your faith in this democratic system, while at times challenged, remains strong. And is that, can you say that in the face of January 6th from your perspective? Because I think you would bring a unique appreciation of exactly what January 6th says and what it means if we
throughout
don't pay
American
attention.
throughout American history, we have been challenged. Our democracy has been challenged. And as a child, I really felt, I mean, I didn't understand it, but the scary barbed wire fence and the sentry towers with the machine guns pointed at us, some of the riots that we had in camp, and uh, at night, some of the quote troublemakers, people that were angry, would their units would be raided and dragged out, and
Mm-hmm.
their wives or sisters or mothers would be screaming and shouting. So I have these very real memories of incarceration and the horror of it. And I remember one assembly that I went to with my father, which turned into a riot, and my father taking me by my hand and running like bats out of hell back to our barrack.
Right.
So I've seen the horrors of it. And January 6th was something like that in a different shape and form.
Right.
Our democracy is always challenged. In the 60s, when we were doing Star Trek, and the utopian idealism of Gene Roddenberry
Yeah.
that we depicted was a result of the turmoil of the 60s, the civil rights movement going
Hmm.
on, the Vietnam War tearing this country. I mean, the war was way out over there in Southeast Asia, but America was being torn apart by those who fiercely supported the war and those who were campaigning hard for peace. And by that time, I was an actor, so I had joined the Hollywood group called EIPJ,
Right.
Entertainment Industry for Peace and Justice. And I became great friends with Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland. As a matter of fact, Jane helped fund one of the rallies that we had in the Asian American community.
Mm.
She was a very generous and fully committed person. And I still bridle at people who see her as a mindless radical. She was really passionate.
No, if you study her history, you know that she was not mindless about anything that she did, particularly when it
Absolutely
came to
not.
her civic responsibilities. So she took it very seriously, and it's fascinating to hear that connection with the two of you, particularly given your own personal journey, to have that sort of reinforcement from a broader community, a white community, as an Asian American, uh, really, and again, as you said, Gene Roddenberry kind of put his finger on this sort of utopian ideal that is evinced in our founding documents,
Precisely.
and to sort of live that out on the screen in Star Trek, as well as in reality through the work you were doing in Hollywood. Uh, it kind of brings me to the point of your TED Talk, where you talk about, why I love the country that once betrayed me. And that narrative of love, that narrative of the ideal still matters. It still has value. And despite the difficulties, you can't give up, because the love is the thing, the love of country, the love of family, the love of community are the things
And
that
the
hold us
love of
together.
the ideals of this country,
Exactly.
democracy.
Yeah.
You know, my father, when I was a teenager, explained to me, in our case, there were no charges. When you're arrested in our democracy, we have what's called due process. When you're arrested, you have to have the right to know why you're arrested. And then you have the right to challenge it in
Right.
a court of law, where they have to back up their charge with evidence. And then, if you indeed uh, are guilty, then you pay the price. There's a punishment. In our case, there was no charge, no trial, just punishment, simply
Right.
because we look like this,
That's right.
our race. And that's the original sin of this country. We know about 1619.
Right.
I mean, for us, our incarceration was 4 years. For African Americans, as you well know,
it's,
for
it's a work in
centuries,
progress.
it's still going
It's
on.
still going
Still
on.
going on. I
It
mean,
was, it
Black
was
Lives Matter. It mattered in 1619 too,
right.
and Asian lives mattered then, and it still hasn't been resolved. Asians are
No,
being
it
attacked
hasn't.
now because of that guy,
Yeah.
that so-called president, constantly saying China virus and Wuhan virus,
Yeah.
Kung flu. Uh, that's the responsibility that he had, that he failed utterly. He betrayed the ideals of democracy, and he fomented uh, uh, stupidity and wild behavior, and that's what January 6th was too. So that's one part of American history that we must overcome by having the majority who are responsible citizens respond to it. And the Congressional Commission right now is uh, doing that process, and that's what, in our case, uh, from the Japanese American community, a movement began to get redress for that unjust imprisonment and the government taking everything that we had. They froze our bank account. I mean,
Yeah.
that's really putting you in a straitjacket.
Oh, yeah.
My father's business was destroyed. Our home was taken because mortgage payments couldn't be made. And so we know that because the people are fallible people, democracy has its fallibility. And we have the job of making sure that our ideals are supported by people who understand what it means. And so every generation has to come up with it. What happened to Japanese Americans in the 40s is happening again on the southern borders
Hmm.
or on our streets where people are spat at and yelled at and assaulted. That happened to us in the 40s too. The words were different words, Jap
Right.
or spy
Right.
or saboteur, but uh, it's the same because our I call teachers the pillars of democracy. Education is so important, and we don't have that opportunity now. The radical people are now assaulting education
Well,
and
critical
making
race theory. Exactly.
exactly. They're
They
not teaching
you,
that,
you
and
can't you can't
yet they
tell your
get
story and
passionate.
my story because some white folks may be traumatized by it. I'm like,
They
what the
mustn't be made to feel guilty. But,
no.
we have a history of guilt. I mean, when the Japanese American community started a movement for an apology and redress, uh, the resistance was very strong. But the amazing thing about American democracy, we had in Congress Japanese Americans, and in the Senate, two Japanese Americans from Hawaii, Senator
Yeah.
Danny Inouye,
Danny Inouye, uh-huh.
loose
Whose arm
rights
was injured during the war. Yeah.
left it in Italy,
Yep.
and Senator Spark Matsunaga, who was also a veteran of the 442nd, two Japanese Americans in the Senate, and we had one, two, three, four congressmen,
Hmm.
and that made the difference too, because they were now part of that legislative body, and Senator Inouye suggested that uh, Congress form a commission, and so in 1980 they formed the commission to gather information on the internment, as if the government didn't have information. They had all the information that
Right.
they
Right.
had covered. And so they held hearings, and I testified at that hearing as a child, as a person who was a child at that time, but how it affected my development as
Hmm.
an American and as a person who believes in democracy. And that I said to the commissioners, we all, you commissioners and the elected officials, have the responsibility to make our ideals really true, to be vibrantly alive, because fallible human beings have
Mm.
been messing it up throughout
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
And so now, with the redress movement for African Americans, Japanese Americans strongly support that. We've been talking about that in the Japanese American Citizens League,
Hmm.
our civil rights organization, somewhat comparable to the NAACP, is strongly in support of redress for African Americans.
Yeah.
How to structure it is a big challenge.
You've been part of one of the leading voices, as a matter of fact, on HR 40, which is the reparations
Right.
legislation. Again, making that case to begin the process of the government redressing these issues. How do you see those storylines playing out in this environment? George, right now we can't even get members of our United States Senate to agree that voting rights in this country matter.
Outrageous.
So Black folks sitting there waiting for reparations, we're like, okay, don't, we'll get back to us, right?
It's almost ludicrous, but it is so deadly serious. And so that's why I say, throughout history, the same thing that happened to Japanese Americans in the 40s, in different form, has been happening throughout our history,
Yeah.
because we have shining, noble ideals, but it's so dependent on fallible human beings. And we've got to get them educated and make them aware that our democracy is very fragile, and it requires people who understand democracy to be actively engaged in it. And the trouble is, these people who call themselves patriots and assault the Capitol are the polar opposite of
Absolutely.
patriots.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I got one last question for you before I let you get out of here. I got to be the Star Trek fan, dude. I'm sorry. I got to go. I grew up in front of my television in our household. Star Trek is a big deal.
Good.
Whenever I'm asked, Captain Picard or Captain Kirk, I'm like, oh hell yes, Captain Kirk. What are you talking about? Absolutely. But the one thing I want to say, because it's interesting how stories evolve, and then backstories you kind of fill in. Your character was one I always thought was cool for a whole lot of reasons. But what I appreciated in sort of the updating of the Star Trek story was the idea that they would show that side, that human side of the character, if you will, in these times, and see that tie in to some of your work in real life with the LGBTQ community, and some of the the idealism of Gene Roddenberry sort of coming through in that respect. How do you see the presentation today of science fiction as a leading indicator of possibly where we can go as a people, not just here in this country, but globally, because Star Trek has that kind of impact, obviously, and you played a role in that.
In the 60s, Star Trek played a very strong leading role, as you well recognize. And science fiction is the freedom of the imagination. And yes, there's the freedom to go dark, as in human society.
Yes, sometimes we do, right?
Yes, but it's also the freedom to really shine. And science fiction, I think, is one of the roads to education, educating us on what might be, and and to illustrate how much we've advanced. Like, here I am talking to you in my study here,
Right.
and you're in Washington D.C.
All right.
or in Maryland,
Maryland, yeah.
and in color, immediate. When we came out of camp back in 1940, actually we came out in 1946. We were one of the last to be released.
Wow.
And my father took us to a movie, a color movie, Technicolor, where it was green, was so lush green, and he took us to see the Adventures of Robin Hood,
Right.
and Sherwood Forest in all its verdant glory, and those crimson capes, velvet capes, and Robin Hood stealing from the rich people and giving it to the poor. I mean, that was a stirring thing. And that, in one of our episodes, the writers came up with the idea, the virus. We were talking about viruses back then.
Yeah, exactly.
That invade our bodies through the palm of our hand, the sweat, and it affects our sense of inhibition or propriety. And when it affected me, the writers had me brandishing a samurai sword. I said to him, well, I'm Japanese American, and so that's ethnically consistent.
Right.
But when I was a kid, I didn't go around playing a samurai in my backyard. I said, Sulu is a 23rd century guy, and his sense of his heritage would be much wider than narrowly ethnic. And I said, when I was a kid, I played Robin Hood in my backyard. My backyard was Sherwood Forest, and Martha Gonzalez was my maid Marian,
Right.
and that skinny, tall, blonde guy was my Friar Tuck, because it was my backyard,
That was
and
your
my mother
backyard.
she made sewed the costumes.
Right, right. You
So
cast it the way you wanted to cast it.
exactly. And so I said, why not put a fencing foil in his hand rather than a samurai sword? Really make it a science fiction thing, you know?
Right.
And he said, that's a great idea. And that turned out to be my favorite episode. When
Wow.
I take my shirt off, all sweaty and
I
having
remember that.
been working
Yes.
out
Yes, a
and,
young,
and
fit
terrorize.
Sulu. Yes. I love it. George Takei, this has been such an enlightening and enjoyable conversation with you.
Lucky me to be talking about all the things I love talking about with you.
No, dude, I'm just a brother in the neighborhood, right?
Yes, you
I'm,
are.
I'm just a player in your backyard. Just cast me as you see me.
I will cast you as a sheriff of
Nottingham.
Nottingham.
That works.
Out of character.
That works for me.
You would make a great villain.
Yeah. Look, I played the devil in Damn Yankee. So
you did.
Oh yeah. I can wear a mean goatee when I need to, right? But
But you're gonna have to act, because you're so good-natured and such a charming guy. It's going to challenge your acting talent.
Well, I will certainly play this part of our conversation for my wife and my kids, so so they know exactly that is true. But I appreciate you, brother. I really do. I appreciate the work you're doing out there. God bless you, and thanks for joining the podcast, my friend.
Live long and prosper.
I like that. See, I could try that, but the fingers I can get. Okay, there we go.
There you are. Let me, to make you feel much better, the high priestess of the Vulcans, this is a Vulcan greeting.
Right.
Was played by Dame Judith Anderson.
That's right, yes.
A luminary of legitimate theater. She was in her Vulcan getup.
I sure remember that, yeah.
When we got to shooting that scene, she could not do this. The high priestess could not greet people with the Vulcan greeting. And so what they did was they put masking tape between her fingers. And for her close-up, she held her fingers in place.
Right.
And on cue, she let go and brought it up like that.
I love it. It's always the little secrets. So that's always the little secrets. That is so cool to know.
No longer a secret. You can broadcast it to the whole MSNBC audience.
Well,
Dame Judith Anderson was a fake Vulcan.
You got any more goodies for me?
Oh, I have a bag full of them.
Oh, I bet you do. Look, I wouldn't even get into the whole conversations about Kirk and Leonard Nimoy. We just leave all that for another time, and then we have a little.
That's a promise.
Have a few drinks on that one.
Oh, good. Yes, I'll certainly join you on that invitation.
George Takei, I appreciate it. Social justice activist, social media superstar, Grammy-nominated recording artist, New York Times best-selling author, and pioneer in both stage, screen, and civic life. Thank you.
Children's picture books.
And children's pictures book. That exactly
to
right.
be coming to your neighborhood bookstores.
Exactly right. And we look forward to you putting that out there for us. And folks, please check it out. It is They Called Us Enemy, and you can get it. It is a wonderful story about, through the eyes of a child, what it was like to live a life inside of an internment camp and still find the American spirit. So I appreciate you, brother. I really, really do. So that does it for this time of our conversation, folks. You know I love it when you do the download thing. It makes me feel all yummy inside. I love to feel yummy inside. I appreciate it. So until next time, do that, be well, and be safe.